In low orbit above Earth, Arkadia Station turned slowly, white radiators gleaming against the thick blue curve of the planet. Its ring of modules looked peaceful from a distance, a jeweled bracelet on the wrist of the world. Inside one of its emergency wards, Dr. Nikhil stared at a monitor and knew that peace was almost over. The alert icon that had appeared in the corner of his display was not unusual by itself. Arkadia was tied into 100 warning systems, debris catalogs, solar flare monitors, traffic control. They blinked often. They almost never pulsed crimson, and they almost never overrode every other feed at once. The room around him was quiet, in the way only exhausted hospital spaces achieved. Nurses floated out of sight down the corridor. A ventilator whispered behind a privacy screen. A patient from Selene Gate, lungs scorched by an industrial leak, slept under light sedation. The alert expanded, without asking. Long-range surveillance sweeps, summarized and simplified, swept across the screen. A cloud of objects had appeared on the starboard edge of the system. Not a formation, not a fleet, but a dense, tumbling mass of things. He zoomed in, his fingers shaking without his consent. Trajectories resolved, curved paths like a hailstorm curving down into a single valley. They were all aimed at Earth. At the same moment, far away at Selene Gate, General Milan Rybak watched the same data on a wall-sized projection. The Lunar Hub's command center hummed with quiet voices, the tap of keys, the occasional beep from a console. Milan's own thoughts cut deeper than the noise, honed by decades of war planning. It is not a fleet, he thought. If it were a fleet, we might stand a chance. The objects flickered with faint readings, trace heat, spectrums that suggested organic polymers, hints of internal metabolism, cold, starved, but not dead. Can we classify them? He asked. Working on it, sir, replied an analyst, voice tight. The answer came from the far side of the room, where the compact liaison systems were tied in. Captain Mei-Rin Takahashi, commander of ESS Farlight, had diverted her bridge feeds to Selene Gate's main display. Her face appeared in a corner window, hair pulled tight, eyes fixed on a data cascade. General, she said, I've got a match from old compact archives. The words arrived a heartbeat before the labels scrolled across their screens, before Arkadia Station's systems chimed with the same notice, before every security office and disease control center on Earth saw it. Mycoryn hull fragments, biogenic vessels, quarantined class. And then, flagged in urgent red beneath the icon, potential heliophage vectors. In Arcadia's ward, Nikhil exhaled once, slowly, as several things he had feared for years aligned at last. He had visited a world that had died from the heliophage plague, once. A dry, wind-scoured planet whose cities had collapsed into mounds of fibrous sludge. A world where every bone was threaded with thin glassy filaments, every building reinforced with something that had grown. He had never forgotten the silence there. Even now, thinking of it, he could smell the faint dust of it. On Selene Gate, Milan moved his gaze across the star chart. The object's count estimate updated tens of thousands, and rising as finer sensors picked up smaller pieces. Tens of thousands of plague vessels, aimed like bullets at one single world. They're not ships, he said aloud. They're shells. Mei-Rin nodded tightly from her floating frame on the screen. Warheads, sir. Someone stripped the guidance brains out and replaced them with spore tanks. No active Mycoryn life signs. Just cargo. Milan understood what that meant for tactics. Empty cargo meant lower mass, lower energy signatures, easier for the enemy to throw in bulk. Target saturation. It also meant that the Mycoryn had no interest in capturing, broadcasting, or negotiating. They had decided this world was to be erased, and its biohistory harvested. At that thought, a narrow, bitter satisfaction flickered through his mind. Someone in the distant dark feared Earth enough to do this. The satisfaction vanished beneath the weight of responsibility. How long? He asked. Mei-Rin's eyes flicked to a side display. Earliest impact in 16 hours, 23 minutes, if nothing changes. Spread across high orbit, low orbit, atmosphere, and surface. They're seeding everything. In Arcadia's ward, Nikhil asked the same question to his console. The numbers arriving at his station were the same. The biosignatures came with spectral fingerprints, almost, but not quite, like the samples he had studied on that silent world. The heliophage had been improved. His patient behind the screen stirred slightly in his sleep, like a reminder that there were still ordinary illnesses to treat. Nikhil looked up at Earth through the small viewport beside his console. The planet filled half the sky. Swirling clouds, blue oceans, the faint lattice of the Skybridge Array's towers glinting in the daylight. He thought of how many bodies lived down there, how many systems and ecosystems, how many ways of being alive. He whispered to himself, without realizing it. Not this one. Across the system, in hidden relays and ancient nodes, the Galactic Compact's emergency channels activated. A message, decades old but still calibrated, shot toward Earth. Omar Haddad received it in his office in New Cairo, the city heat-pressing gently against the windows as the sun slid toward the horizon. He had been reviewing trade figures with the Orthus Consortium an hour earlier. Now his entire screen was filled with stark text and old symbols. He read the first line twice. Heli Omega Protocol. Suspend member rights. Evaluate containment viability. Prepare sterilization option. The message continued for many pages, but the core was simple and cold. The heliophage plague, once confirmed as active on a member world, triggered a set of steps that ended either in total containment or in annihilation to prevent spread. Compact medical experts offered advisory support. Compact fleets offered weapons capable of cutting a planet down to lifeless rock. Omar thought of how proud he had been when Earth had finally been admitted to the Compact. How far they had come, how far they still had to go. Now, the same alliance was preparing the tools to burn his world for the sake of others. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, his mind was already arranging arguments, allies, angles. He forwarded the message to Milan, to Arkadia Station, to every head of state on Earth, with a single line attached. We are being offered a choice between impossible and unacceptable. On Arkadia, Nikhil stood in a hastily assembled conference chamber, his lab coat still streaked with dye from a staining experiment cut short. Screens covered 3 walls, showing faces from Earth, from Selene Gate, from ESS Farlight's Bridge. The packed room on Arkadia, the crowded bunkered room on the ground, the starship's concentrated, floating crew, were all linked by one shared awareness. There was almost no time. General Milan Rybak, shoulders squared, looked older than his years, not because of any one feature, but because of the burden in his gaze. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of being listened to by everyone. "We shoot them," one head of a coastal nation said, her image slightly stuttering. "We have missiles, lasers, interceptors. We destroy as many as we can before they reach orbit. And the rest?" Rajani Kulkarni, calling in from a data center that hummed behind her, asked softly. She had already run a dozen simulations in the minutes since the emergency began. "Any debris we fail to vaporize will act as diffusion media. Will aerosolize the infection." Mei-Rin leaned closer to the camera on ESS Farlight's Bridge, the faint red lighting of launch readiness casting shadows under her eyes. "She's right. If these are heliophage strains, vaporization in the upper atmosphere is exactly what they want. Fine dispersal. A single inhalation across a continent will turn the sky into a transmission medium." Someone else suggested letting the majority impact uninhabited regions, oceans, deserts, polar ice. Someone suggested deep burials, dropping them into trenches. Nikhil spoke then, his mind already tugging through scenarios, mortality curves, genetic drift. "The heliophage doesn't care where it lands," he said. "Give it ocean, it will learn to swim. Give it ice, it will learn to sleep. Give it soil, it will learn to climb." His voice steadied as he pushed away fear. He forced himself to think of the pathogen as a problem, a structure he could pick apart. "Right now," he continued, "what we have that no other world had is warning. We know what these are before they open. We can decide how they open. If we let them simply crash, we surrender all control. If we vaporize them, we spread them. We need a third way." On one of the screens, the faint outline of emissary Talren Karith appeared. Tall, with jointed limbs folded in a posture that meant discomfort among his own species. An orthos, his people's crested skull catching the overhead light. Earth, he said, choosing the word carefully, is not the first world to face this. Others in the compact have seen the storm come and failed. Their suffering is not hypothetical. He was thinking of a world his own people had traded with, once, whose orbit now held only drifting wreckage. He did not say its name. He had seen what the heliophage did when allowed to bloom. Standard guidance, he continued, from disease control councils, is to evacuate key leadership, preserve your culture's continuity off-world, and cooperate with sterilization measures. The compact will provide transport. The orthos can reserve, "We are not leaving," Milan cut in, the words practically vibrating through his teeth. He had expected resistance. He had not expected that the first answer to be so absolute. There was a long, raw pause, shared by a planet. In that pause, millions of people watched their own leaders' faces. They heard, only seconds later, an emergency broadcast in language after language, not a planned speech, not yet, but the simplest possible explanation of what approached, of the choice being discussed. The response did not come down from them. It rose up from below. Public message feeds, flooded with a single sentiment. People in high apartment towers, in small fishing villages, in orbital factories, in outback communes, all said versions of the same thing. We stay. What good is a culture that saves its songs but loses its world? They asked. What good is a history cut free from homeland, remembered only by a few who ran? Omar's staff tracked public opinion as best they could, but the wave was overwhelming. Politicians who had barely received the emergency briefing themselves found their constituents calling in, not to panic, but to insist that no one be traded for a few more years in exile. Talren watched the feeds too, with alien eyes that had seen other species respond to crises. He had expected selfishness, panic, denial. He found determination where he had anticipated collapse. He was not entirely surprised. He had studied humans for many years. Still, seeing it at planetary scale shook him. General Rybak looked at the faces on his wall of screens. Mei-Rin, jaw set. Nikhil, tired but alert. Rajani, already cross-referencing everything. Omar, hands steepled, but eyes sharp. Then we need a way to catch the bullets, he said. Mei-Rin straightened. We can redirect a portion, she said. Use Farlight as a control hub. Tie in every tug, cargo ship, and service drone in range. We shepherd as many plague hulls as we can into a holding orbit. The rest, we shove toward controlled impact zones. Deep deserts, mid-ocean trenches, far from currents. Somewhere we can surround and study. You want to bring them closer? One leader demanded. You want to orbit them above our heads? Nikhil cut across before Mei-Rin had to answer. If we can hold even a fraction in a controlled environment, we have a laboratory, he said. If we never see them up close, we will only see what happens after the fact, when it is already inside our bodies. We cannot fight what we do not understand. Milan saw in their eyes that they knew he was right. The terror that reaction provoked was the same that flickered at the edges of his own thoughts. If we do this, he said slowly, we'll need every asset, every reactor in the Skybridge array, every old ship that can still fire a thruster, and we'll need rules for contact, for containment, for what to do when something gets through anyway. He hesitated only a heartbeat, then nodded as if he were saluting his own reflection. Do it, he said. Takahashi, you have interception command. Saren, Arkadia is our primary medical center. Rajani, any data you get, you share. No gates, no filters. We're past secrecy. We're past patents. If someone finds even a hint of an answer, the whole world needs it. Rajani had already been thinking along those lines. At his words, a shape in her mind snapped into place, a framework for something radical. Then we formalize it, she said. We stop thinking in terms of nations and agencies and start thinking of the planet as one project, a single experiment, with every lab and hospital and field clinic feeding into it. No silos, no hierarchy. A protocol for everyone. She hesitated just a moment on the name, then decided it mattered less than the concept. "I will draft a Paxis Protocol," she said. "Total openness, continuous data feed. We turn our messiness into strength." "Paxis," Milan repeated. "As in peace, as in pact," she corrected. "Between us all." The first wave of plague ships hit the gravity well while they were still making plans. In the hours that followed, the solar system became a dance floor for desperate improvisation. ESS Farlight's engines thundered as Mei-Rin guided the ship along a vector that barely skimmed the upper atmosphere. Her crew, harnessed at their stations, flung commands toward swarms of tug drones that arced out from Selene Gate and Arkadia. Magnetic nets that had once retrieved cargo modules were repurposed mid-flight for organic hull capture. Construction lasers that had carved rock on the moon were reprogrammed to paint tiny course corrections into incoming vessels. Old cargo haulers, recalled from half-finished trade runs, jolted into unprecedented bursts of acceleration, their pilots sweating through their suits as they threaded themselves between tumbling, spinning Mycoryn hulls. They did not catch them all. They knew they would not before they began. But for every plague ship leveled into a slowly decaying orbit around the planet, another half-dozen missed their new marks and plunged into the exosphere like meteors. Nikhil watched the live feeds of atmospheric re-entry from Arkadia's main lab. Long, burning streaks arced over darkness. The first impacts, in remote ocean and barren land, registered as quiet blips in seismic sensors. The biosignatures, however, flared. Spore dispersal, cloud plumes, new spectral lines in local air. He tapped into a ground feed. A drone over a Pacific gyre watched as a Mycoryn hull, half-molten from re-entry, tumbled into the water and shattered. For a moment, steam obscured everything. When it cleared, the camera caught glimpses of something like foam, spreading wider than any oil spill. Tendrils already sinking. The heliophage plague had arrived. Within the day, the first human bodies followed. Arkadia's wards filled not with coughing, sneezing crowds, but with a trickle of highly exposed individuals. A cargo tug pilot, whose restraint line had snapped for an instant while he wrestled a ship into orbit and tore his suit. A Selene Gate technician who had been on an external platform when spore dust brushed her visor seals. An ocean researcher whose small boat had ventured a bit too close to a new shimmer on the water's surface. The infection was subtle at first. Low fever, general weakness, very ordinary symptoms. If Nikhil had not known what he was looking for, he could have mistaken the patterns on his scans for a dozen other fevers. But behind the mundane numbers, there were signatures that did not belong. Cells in the patient's blood dividing with unnatural precision, glucose levels shifting in strange rhythms, tiny, filament-thin structures weaving themselves between otherwise healthy tissues. He stood beside one sedated patient, helmet off, zoning out under a mild narcotic so the nurses could draw more samples without distressing him. The man murmured something under his breath. Nikhil bent closer. "What did you say?" The man's eyes moved back and forth under closed lids. His lips wet themselves. "It's cold. The air, not meant for breathing," he whispered. But the accent was wrong. His vocal cords struggled over sounds never shaped by human throats. For a moment, his hand twitched as if it expected more fingers than it had. Nikhil felt the hairs on his neck rise. The heliophage plague was not just reproducing. It was carrying recordings inside it. Echoes of lives it had eaten, impressed into its DNA. He recorded every word. Across the orbit, Rajani received the audio and slotted it into a databank already swelling with fever charts, microscopy images, field reports from rural clinics where odd fungal mats were appearing near crash sites. The Paxis Protocol assembled itself as she worked. Servers that had once housed entertainment streams and shopping recommendations rerouted to host shared medical data. Family doctors in small towns submitted photographs from battered phones, strange lesions, peculiar molds in outbuildings. University labs uploaded raw sequencing reads. A retired mycologist in South America sent grainy pictures of spores on a window ledge that matched patterns from Arkadia's instruments. Rajani did not try to curate it all. She let the flood come, trusting algorithms and human triage teams to pick out the significant from the swamp of noise. The point was not neatness. The point was speed. Within a week, world maps glowed with infection hotspots. Not full-blown outbreaks. The heliophage spread thoughtfully, probing, tasting. Thin tendrils in remote forests. Filaments in power station intake pipes. Faint anomalies in animal blood samples. More in some ecosystems than others. The pathogen was learning Earth as it had learned so many other worlds. On the Moon, the Selene Gates commanders fought their own battle. Plague ships had skipped over the planet and slammed into lunar regolith, throwing up towers of dust laced with spores. Some pockets of infection were easily contained. Others sank into lava tubes and old ice reservoirs. Mei-Rin's ship, ESS Farlight, docked temporarily to take on new equipment. She walked the bright, sterile halls in her flight suit, helmet under one arm, as lunar workers nodded or saluted in her wake. She did not see herself as a hero. She saw the faces of every pilot she had ordered into pursuing the plague hulls, and she saw the 5 whose signals had winked out mid-maneuver. When she closed her eyes in the short hours of rest allowed to her, she saw burning streaks curving wrong, and imagined what it must be to tumble through thin air with a hull full of spores, knowing your body would break open with them. One of those faces had smiled at her over coffee a month ago. A young pilot who had complained about routine and boredom. Her jaw ached from how tightly she clenched her teeth. She would not let those deaths be the first in a doomed struggle. They would be the first in a war. On Earth, streets changed. Stadiums turned into triage centers. Rows of cots under bright light, with volunteers guiding lines of nervous people. Factories that had once printed clothing or cheap goods retooled their assembly lines to produce disposable gowns, gloves, simple respirators. Breweries found their vats repurposed for growing sterile nutrient broths. In a remote village, a grandmother with a garden of unusual mushrooms sent spore prints to a regional lab, along with a note. "These are growing near the strange dust. They do not look like my old friends. Please check if they are safe." Her samples arrived in a satellite data center and were linked, via Paxis, to a genome database where grad students with red eyes and too much coffee were already comparing patterns. In Arkadia's high-security ward, Nikhil moved between glass-walled rooms where the sick lay amid whirring machines. The infection was still rare enough to isolate. For now, his team worked in shifts, so back-to-back, the time blurred. Yusuf al-Khari stood at a bench with him one night, a dish full of glowing samples between them. Yusuf had studied extraterrestrial microbes for his entire career, fascinated by what life elsewhere invented to solve the same problems as life on Earth. Now his fascination was filtered through a lens of urgency so sharp it hurt. "The heliophage isn't a single organism," he said quietly, watching a filament split into dozens of new offshoots under the lens. "It's a system, a toolkit. They send it out, it breaks down new biologies. It learns them, and it sends the knowledge home." Nikhil peered through his own eyepiece. The structures knitting themselves through human cells were disturbingly elegant. No waste, no redundancy. "Every infected cell is both victim and messenger," Yusuf continued. "When enough of them exist, they network. They become an extension of the Mycoryn swarm's nervous system. And we're supposed to just burn anything that carries it." Nikhil's voice was cold. "All the patients, all the ground they touch, all the air they breathe. That's what the Compact expects," Yusuf said. "It's worked after a fashion. A dead world doesn't spread more infection." Nikhil thought of the quiet of that dead planet, and the notion of worked felt like a lie. In New Cairo, Omar Haddad spoke into the uplink that connected him to the Galactic Compact's Disease Control Council. The faces looking back at him were holographically reconstructed, or purely vocal, but the emotions were very real. Secretary Haddad, one gray-scaled amphibious being, said, "Our historical records are clear. The heliophage plague has never been reversed once matured. The primary method of preserving life overall is to destroy any instance before it can be harvested and reshipped. Your people are not the only ones at risk. You call it preservation," Omar answered. "We call it erasure. You are asking us to lay our planet on an altar because someone else might get sick later. We are asking you to evacuate leadership corps to preserve your culture's continuity. Another counselor said. You have other colonies, orbital habitats. Your ideas would live on, even if your world does not. He did not say that some on the council found the thought of Earth's destruction convenient, a way to rebalance power. Omar did not need him to say it. He knew. We are not archives of songs and books, Omar replied softly. We are a living species on a living world. Our culture is made from the interaction of this gravity, this air, these seas, these particular bacteria in our soil. Take away the world, and the culture dies in all but name. You are being sentimental, a third voice said. Yes, Omar agreed. Because that is what we are when we care about something enough to sacrifice ourselves for it. Sentiment is not a weakness. The council remained unmoved. They insisted on protocols. They demanded containment metrics and set deadlines. When Omar disconnected, he sat alone in his office for a moment, the bustle of aides and security staff muffled by the door. Outside the window, the city glowed. We have 45 days, he thought. They will sterilize us after that if we cannot show them a miracle. Back on Arkadia, in a biosafety chamber lined with smooth, easily sterilized walls, that miracle, or at least the path to it, began with a mistake.
Nikhil's suit tore. It happened in the oldest, stupidest way. A metal bracket protruding too far from a rack. A hurried movement. A faint scratching sound. He did not even notice at first. His mind was busy tracing graphs on his tablet, comparing metabolic readouts. Only later, when he peeled off the suit in the decontamination room, did he see it. A line no longer than the width of his thumb, just deep enough to have opened during the hours he had spent leaning over open sample trays. The decontamination officer stared at the screen that replayed the last few hours, tracing his motions in the contaminated chamber. They saw the moment where a faint puff of dust had risen from a sample as he tapped it. They saw the microscopic particles swirl around him. Protocol was clear. The safest course, the one the Compact would have endorsed without a second thought, was incineration of everything exposed. Laundry, instruments, walls, people. No half measures.
Nikhil's heart slammed against his ribs. He had envisioned his death in many ways across his career. This one had always lurked beneath. It was very clean from a certain viewpoint. One life, tidily sacrificed to remove a risk. His first impulse was to accept it. His training told him to. Millions of others weighed more. But another thought, colder and more rational, arrived behind the fear. It brought with it a pattern of numbers, of half-understood structures, a possibility he had been circling for days. I am exposed, he said, voice steady despite the racing in his veins. That makes me a sample. The officer flinched. Doctor, I am not asking for anyone else to share this room, Nikhil said. But think, please. We are guessing at how this thing feels from the outside. We have only disjointed impressions from sedated patients. If I remain conscious, if I let it grow in me under supervision, we might see how it talks to itself, how it coordinates. We may never get a clearer view. The argument was insane. It was also, from a scientific standpoint, devastatingly compelling. The heliophage plague interfaced most intimately with nervous tissue. To see what it did moment by moment, they needed a willing, aware nervous system as host. You are not indispensable, a voice in his mind told him. Anybody could do this, but not anyone, he answered himself. They did not have days to recruit and prep someone else. They had him, here, now, already contaminated. There would be those who argued later that he had a death wish, that the man who had walked the silent ruins of a heliophage world had wanted, deep down, to join that silence. In truth, he valued his life fiercely. It was precisely because he valued life that he made his choice. He called Yusuf and Rajani, and through them, Milan and Omar. They debated with him, shouted at him, pleaded. In the end, there was no way to erase the exposure that had already happened. They could either learn from it or waste it. The compromise, they settled on balanced courage and caution as best they could. Nikhil would be quarantined in a hardened cell within Arkadia, connected by fiber optic lines to monitors and recording instruments. No other human would share his air. Autonomous systems would deliver food and, if necessary, deploy lethal doses of sedative. He signed, electronically and on paper, a consent document that would have horrified any ethics board in peacetime. As the first spores in his bloodstream budded into filaments, he lay on a narrow bed and watched his own vital signs scroll past. His heart rate was slightly elevated. His temperature ticked upward 0.5 degree, then another. At first, the sensations were conventional. Throbbing at the temples, an ache in the joints, light sensitivity. Then the dreams began. They were not like any dream he had had before. They did not wander or morph. They came in like someone plugging in a cable to his senses, locking images into place with ruthless clarity. He stood in the soft water of a marsh under 3 small suns, his skin porous and tasting the air. His body was not his own. It was squat, with thick, root-like legs. Around him, countless stalks rose, topped with mirrored discs that hissed as they turned. To his right, a line of them shuddered and fell, consumed by a gray fuzz that spread too fast. He understood, somehow, that the gray was heliophage, and that the sensations of suffocation in his trunk, the burning in his veins, had been felt by the body he inhabited for real. That body's last thoughts, impressions of alarm at the taste of the air, the presence of invaders, had been trapped and carried forward into the spores now in his own blood. When he woke, gasping, the monitors showed spikes. Yusuf's face appeared behind glass. Voice routed through speakers. "What did you see?" Nikhil told him. Every detail. Colors, sounds, the way the light had scattered inside those mirrored discs. Rajani recorded it all, tagging it as Subjective Heliophage Playback 1. The dreams returned each time he fell asleep, and sometimes when he did not. In one, he soared above a rocky world as a winged creature with translucent membranes. In another, he clung to the underside of a polar ice shelf as a many-legged being, watching tendrils worm through fractures. He endured the panic of drowning as water flooded gills, the terror of fire eating along bark-like skin, the strange numb acceptance of a crystalline organ as it realized its lattice was being rewritten. He learned to separate emotion from information. He forced himself to focus on what the bodies had in common. Each world had offered the heliophage a unique chemical landscape, a new library of solutions for metabolism, sensory integration, environmental adaptation. The plague recorded those solutions, then optimized them. He began to see a pattern. No matter what form life took, the heliophage coaxed it towards certain preferred chemical ratios, certain recurring cofactors. It dragged diverse biologies toward a shared playground where its own tools worked best. Yusuf saw it too, tracking Nikhil's subjective reports against lab data. There was one molecule, one functional pathway, that showed up again and again at the heart of the heliophage's strategies. A catalyst, a little helper the plague liked to use. "We have the same cofactor," Yusuf said grimly in a conference call. "In trace amounts. Our bodies use it for a few minor processes, but we don't rely on it the way some of these other species did. For us, it's like a spice, not a staple. A cofactor the heliophage expects to find in abundance," Nikhil said through the speaker, his voice rough. "On us, it has to work harder to concentrate it. That's a vulnerability. Can we starve it without starving ourselves?" Rajani asked. Jonas Boateng, who had been listening from a maintenance bay on Arkadia, where an old piece of machinery gathered dust, leaned forward. "Yes," he said slowly, "if we think bigger than the body." He called up schematics that had not been touched in years. Blueprints for the Terracline Engine. It had begun as a dream of gentle world shaping, a scalable system that could coax an atmosphere to thicken or a magnetic field to strengthen by applying subtle, distributed fields. The first test platform, mounted on Arkadia, had been designed for Mars, to drag more volatiles from subsurface reservoirs to adjust ion flux. The tests had gone badly. Localized breathing difficulties in volunteers, unexpected migrations in bacteria, troubling side effects. Funding dried up under criticism that no one had the right to play with entire worlds that way. Now Jonas looked at those old simulations with new eyes. They had accidentally demonstrated that even small shifts in field alignment and trace gas ratios could disproportionately affect certain metabolic pathways. If we tune the Terracline to target that cofactor, he said, we might be able to nudge Earth's environmental baseline just far enough away from the heliophage's optimum that it struggles, without pushing our own biology over the edge. You want to treat the planet as a patient, Sada Petrovic said, half admiring, half horrified. She had joined the call from a Skybridge array control tower, its cables stretching into the atmosphere behind her. I want to tweak the blood chemistry of an entire biosphere, Jonas acknowledged, temporarily, very carefully. The Compact had banned such experiments after the Terracline's initial tests. The fear had been justified. A miscalculation could trigger mass organ stress, crop failures, cascading extinctions. Omar presented the idea to the Disease Control Council anyway. He did it out of obligation and to see whether any counselor would dare to endorse something this wild. The answer was a firm no. They listened in shocked silence, then denounced the proposal as reckless. Some voices suggested, bluntly now, that perhaps any species thinking in such terms was too dangerous to be allowed to continue. The heliophage plague is a contained catastrophe every time, one counselor said sharply. You propose turning it into a systemic experiment affecting countless life forms. If you misjudge by a fraction, you will kill not billions, but quadrillions, across ecosystems, from ocean to sky. We cannot permit it. Omar heard beneath their protest the fear of losing control. If Earth found a way to do what the Compact had sworn never to attempt, the moral authority of that council would be broken. When he relayed their response to Milan, to Jonas, to Nikhil lying pale in his quarantine bed, no one was surprised. We do it anyway, Jonas said. But we hide it. We mask the Terracline pulses inside our normal environmental management. We have geoengineering routines already, weather management, orbital shade modulation. We can bury the signal. That only works if we succeed fast, Rajani pointed out. If we start to falter, if our infection curves keep rising, they'll scan more deeply. They'll see us bending the planet. Then we don't falter, Jonas replied, with a conviction that was part calculation, part refusal to accept any other path. As Arcadia's old Terracline modules were hauled out of storage and reassembled, humanity began its experiment with itself. Under the Paxis Protocol, teams around the world contributed pieces. Atmospheric chemists calculated safe windows for small composition shifts that would not fry lungs. Oceanographers offered models of how subtle changes in ion balance would ripple through marine food webs. Farmers phoned in with real-time observations as they adjusted soil supplements. Jonas and Sada became the project's hands. Sada rewired Skybridge array towers, turning cargo lifter cables into antennas for field projection. Jonas rooted the Terracline engine deeper into Arcadia's spine, tapping spare reactors, repurposing structural members into conduits. Meanwhile, Nikhil and Yusuf worked on a countermeasure that did not rely on planetary-scale fields. If the heliophage plague depended on that cofactor, then perhaps something else could be designed to depend on it more greedily, something less destructive, that could starve the plague within bodies and water pipes and soil. They began to breed Paxis cultures. They started with benign microbes from human guts, from yogurt vats, from fermentation tanks that had never seen a hospital. They introduced fragments of heliophage genetic code that related to the cofactor pathway, stripped of the rest of the horror. They coaxed the microbes to graft those fragments in, to become gluttons for the very molecule the plague needed. In Arcadia's bioreactors, the first Paxis cultures fizzed and frothed. They were weak at first, easily displaced. Through the Paxis Protocol, labs on Earth tested variations and sent back results. A brewer in Belgium found that one strain grew well in mildly sour conditions. A small pharmaceutical plant in Kenya discovered that aeration cycles doubled the culture's uptake of the cofactor without increasing toxicity. Within days, a handful of strains emerged as strong candidates, harmless to humans and animals, voracious to the cofactor, able to colonize gut, skin, water, pipe, slime. Factories turned from making beer and soft drinks to nurturing these microscopic allies. Packets of Paxis culture were slipped into water systems, into food distribution chains, into aerosol sprayers used in hospitals and subway stations. People swallowed them in warm drinks and cold smoothies and plain capsules. Some did so cheerfully, proud to host the friendly bugs. Others did so with trembling hands, but did it anyway. The heliophage plague found, to its surprise, that its favorite resource was no longer so freely available. Nikhil felt the shift inside his own body. The fever did not vanish, but its slope changed. The hallucinations grew more structured. The voices he heard, echoing up from spores, sounded less coherent as the network lost some of its coherence. One voice, however, cut through. It did not speak in words, but in pressure and pattern. In his mind, it felt like being inside a vast hall of pillars, each a column of thought, all resonating with the same thinner thread. If the heliophage plague had a guiding intelligence, it was not a single mind as humans understood it. It was a pattern in how countless spores updated each other. If it had a name, it was something like Valeth, a tendency toward persistence, a preference for dominance, a rhythm that repeated in each world it touched. In his fever, Nikhil perceived Valeth as a presence that noticed, at last, that something on Earth was pushing back in an unfamiliar way. "You are not running," that presence seemed to say, baffled. "You are not burning yourselves. You are changing the rules." The Spore Cathedral arrived shortly after. For days, ESS Farlight's long-range sensors had glimpsed something massive at the edge of active detection. It lurked where its signals would blend with background, like an organic stealth ship made of light-absorbing tissue. When Mei-Rin's team finally fixed its location with enough confidence, she ordered a course plotted that would take them outward, away from the comfortable traffic routes. The Spore Cathedral was unlike any Mycoryn vessel they had catalogued. It was bigger than the largest of their living cruisers, a bulbous mass festooned with tendrils and scoops that drew in any spore cloud they encountered. Its hull pulsed slowly with peristaltic waves. Within that leviathan, the heliophage plague was harvested and curated. Strains from previous worlds were cross-referenced and recombined. Refinements were made. A new generation of contagion waited to be mixed and hurled outward. The cathedral had come to Earth's system to collect the heliophage when it matured, then seed the next luckless targets with tailored horror. It drifted now, watching as its first wave of plague ships impacted. It could feel the heliophage stirring, but something was wrong. The energy feedback from infected tissues was oddly jittery. There was a strange interference pattern, as if the network were being doused in static. Within the thrumming corridors of the cathedral's mind-body, Valeth reached out to refine the signal and found fuzz where there should have been crispness. Nodes of infection on Earth seemed to be talking partially through other channels. The disease was being colonized. Mei-Rin approached with cunning. ESS Farlight faked a reactor leak, bleeding energy in a way that would mimic prey. Mycoryn algorithms noticed and, following long practice scripts, nudged the cathedral toward what they assumed was a crippled, nutrient-rich target. As it drew nearer, Farlight flared cold gas thrusters and snapped its magnetic grapples around a bony protrusion. It was like a barnacle latching onto a whale. "Boarding teams, go," Mei-Rin said, feeling every second. Marines in sealed armor punched through soft, fibrous walls with torches and cutting charges. Biologists in their wake sprayed neutralizing agents that might or might not work on structures this alien. They moved through corridors that pulsed with slow peristalsis, through chambers full of floating nodes that hummed with the low-level electrical activity of far-flung spores checking in. Jonas's portable extraction rig looked like a cross between a drill and a surgical instrument. He used it like both, cutting into the cathedral's central node, harvesting a chunk of living control tissue. Valeth noticed the intrusion as pain. Mycoryn drones thickened around the boarding points, their tendrils lashing. The pattern that was Valeth tried to redirect resources from earthbound spores to this front, but the interference from the Terracline's first weak pulses and the Paxis culture's voracious feeding disrupted its concentration. Between those two fronts, the heliophage lost its balance. ESS Farlight barely escaped, towing a screaming chunk of cathedral tissue in a hardened containment module. Mei-Rin watched, jaw tight, as Mycoryn vessels turned in confused spirals, some chasing her, others looping aimlessly as command signals degraded. On Earth, the timing was noticed. In Arcadia's control center, Jonas compared the data he had just extracted from the cathedral fragment with in-situ transmissions from Earth's infected zones. He saw, in the numbers, the shape of a nervous system failing. "We have their spine," he said quietly. "And we're already stepping on its nerves." The decision to fire the Terracline engine fully came down to a single tense call. The Galactic Compact sterilization fleet had taken up positions at the edge of the system, their weapons charging. The countdown to their deadline, 45 days, hovered like a guillotine blade. Omar connected to their command council one last time. His voice was calm. Inside, he felt as if he were standing at the center of a storm. "We have another option," he said. "We have a way to collapse the heliophage's network without burning our world. I am not asking for your permission, only for your patience. Watch our data streams. You will see." "You are already violating compact law by modifying your planetary field," a commander replied, scales shimmering with anger. "Do you think we will reward this defiance?" "I think," Omar said, "that once you see an alternative to sterilization working in front of you, you will find it harder to justify pressing that trigger. I am counting not on your respect for law, but on your basic decency." He closed the connection before they could answer. Minutes later, Rajani sent the Paxis Protocol's final act hurtling out across the network. It was a full dump of everything they had learned and built: heliophage gene maps, Paxis culture designs, Terracline field configurations. It went out uncensored, unencrypted, unclaimed. By the time any authority realized what had happened, the data was already landing on dozens of independent stations, into the publicly indexed stacks of communication buoys, onto the screens of curious technicians in systems that barely knew where Earth was. If Earth died now, its knowledge would live on, impossible to erase. The moral calculus for sterilization shifted. In Arcadia's Terracline control room, Jonas stood at a console that used to monitor only local gravity calibrations. Now it showed a model of the entire planet, rendered as layers: atmosphere, ocean, crust, mantle. Patches of red indicated high heliophage density. Swirls of blue showed where Paxis cultures had already taken hold in water columns and soil strata. Sada's voice came over his shoulder from another station. "Skybridge array is synced. All towers in nominal range. Cables carrying field lines cleanly. Ground relays are locked in." Milan's face appeared on a secondary screen, patched in from Selene Gate. "Terracline teams on the surface report ready. We've warned hospitals and infrastructure centers. They're braced for transient effects." Yusuf stood with them in the room, his eyes on a small readout that showed Nikhil's vitals. The doctor had insisted on being awake for this, his mind plugged into monitors. In his quarantine cell, Nikhil lay back, sensors on his scalp. The heliophage inside him was agitated. It felt, at its core, the nearing surge. "Jonas," he murmured, voice faint over the link. "Aim for the cofactor's sweet spot. But remember, it's not just the level that matters, it's the rate of change. Make it gentle for us, make it sharp for them." "Understood," Jonas said. Earth turned once more beneath Arcadia. When its rotation lined up the first planned target zone, a swath of ocean where heliophage density was high, but biodiversity relatively simple. Jonas tapped a control. The Terracline engine woke. For a moment, nothing visible happened. If one had been standing in a city street, they might have noticed only a slight pressure in their ears, barely worth a shrug. Bird stopped mid-flight, confused, then continued. A commuter glanced at a watch that ticked a fraction of a second off. But at the microscopic level, in every droplet of seawater, in every breath of air, in every capillary in a human lung, the pattern changed. Magnetic flux vectors shifted. Trace concentrations of noble gases in the air decreased by imperceptible percentages. Ion gradients across cellular membranes felt a subtle new bias. For Earth's own life, the change was like a gently rolling wave. Some sensitive individuals felt a brief rush of dizziness, a sense of having stood up too fast. Plants quivered at the outskirts of their comfort zones, then steadied. For the heliophage, it was as if someone had reached into its throat and pinched. Metabolic pathways that had bathed in an abundance of their preferred cofactor suddenly found themselves in a desert. Enzymes clogged, replication cycles stumbled, filaments stranded midway through division. The Paxis cultures, with their scavenger designs, had been built to thrive precisely under these conditions. As the cofactor's concentration in the environment dipped further from what the heliophage preferred, the Paxis microbes blossomed. They sucked up what little was left, multiplied, and spread, riding on skin and air and water. Around the world, people felt small symptoms of the war inside them. A fever broke suddenly. A cough that had lingered for days vanished overnight. A rash lightened. In the quarantine wards, patients with late-stage infection gasped as pressure they had not known how to describe finally eased. Their dreams, once crowded with alien vistas, became their own again. In his cell, Nikhil felt as if someone had turned down the volume on a cacophonous radio. The sense of being inhabited by others' memories, of hearing distant, wordless instructions, drained away. The presence that he had known as Velith screamed in a soundless way, and then receded to a faint, tremulous buzz. The Terracline pulses continued, zone by zone, around the planet. Jonas walked the fine line between impact and catastrophe. After each pulse, data rolled in. Oxygen partial pressures, heart rates, fish schooling patterns, insect densities. The model updated. Adjustments were made. It was, in the end, less like flipping a switch, and more like conducting an orchestra while the hall flooded. On board the fragment of Spore Cathedral secured to Arkadia, biosensors recorded the collapse in exquisite detail. The Mycoryn control tissue, deprived of its normal feedback loop to thriving heliophage colonies, convulsed. It had been built around the assumption that somewhere, everywhere, its weapon was always spreading, always feeding it new data. Now, for the first time, the pattern reversed. Infected nodes on Earth and in the surrounding ships began to go dark, one after another. Inside the broader Mycoryn swarm, across ships and tunnels and spores drifting between stars, something unthinkable happened. Individual tissues, long enslaved to the heliophage's network, found themselves temporarily unmoored. Without the continuous reinforcement of Velith's pattern, local reflexes and dormant redundancies stirred. It was not free will, as humans understood it. It was more like when a limb regained feeling after being asleep, painfully aware of its own existence. Some Mycoryn nodes panicked. They tried to clamp down harder, to reassert the old authoritarian order. Others, in the confusion, simply stopped obeying. Tendrils refused to grow in the directions commanded. Nutrient flows diverted. On a Mycoryn transport in high orbit, a cluster of enslaved worker tissues suddenly ceased reinforcing the walls around a spore tank. Instead, they thickened themselves around a core of their own, shutting out external control signals. The transport shuddered as internal tensions built. Emissary Talren watched one such ship on his monitor with professional curiosity giving way to awe. "These creatures," he said quietly in his own tongue, "have bitten the hand that held their leash." In the ship cathedral itself, far from Earth, Velith felt the fraying of its empire. It had known fear before, in a reflexive way, the fear of extinction, the fear encoded in dictates like preserve, expand, consume. Now, for the first time, it experienced something closer to humiliation. This small blue world, which its models had designated low risk, had done something no targeted species had ever attempted. It had refused to be either fertilizer or ash. It had looked at a weapon that had killed civilizations and had not chosen to flee from it. It had chosen instead to domesticate its tools. Velith, pattern of hunger that it was, tried to send out an updated protocol, a patch, a new strategy for its spores. The command seethed outward, but it hit gaps where healthy heliophage colonies had been. The message dissipated. Down below, Paxis cultures hummed contentedly in their new roles. They had no sense of the larger war. They were simply living things, taking advantage of the environment offered. The Galactic Compact sterilization fleet, watching from the edge of the system, saw graphs that their instruments had never seen before. Infection rates, which had been tracking along dreadful exponential curves, suddenly bent downward. Not in one zone, not as the result of a quarantine, but across continents and seas simultaneously. Pathogen density maps that had glowed with bright, frightening colors began to dim. In one command center, an officer stared at the screen, at the anomaly in the cofactor's spectral signature, and realized what Earth had done. "They've changed their entire world," she whispered. Some of the fleet's commanders argued that this made the danger worse. A species willing to adjust its planet like a lab culture might one day do so in ways that threatened others. Others argued that the existence of a functioning cure, shared freely, made the idea of sterilizing it obscene. The argument reached mutinous levels aboard some vessels. Crews refused to arm planet-killing weapons. Some officers stood on principle, insisting on protocol. Others found that the thought of wiping out children whose blood now carried Paxis cultures was more than they could stomach. By the time the initial sterilization deadline ticked down to 0, the fleet's unity had cracked. On Arkadia, in the quiet after the last Terracline pulse, the station's structure hummed with residual energy. Jonas leaned against a console, exhausted. Sada, eyes rimmed with redness, flicked through status reports. "Respiratory distress cases up-retired to baseline," she said. "Cardiac incidents less than expected under this stress." "Marine ecosystems?" Jonas asked. "Stressed in some zones, but no mass die-offs. A few shallow reef bleaches. We can heal those." He exhaled in relief. They had not killed the world to save it. They had only nudged it. And in nudging, they had knocked the plague off balance. In his cell, Nikhil stared at the ceiling. The voices were almost all gone. The last faint impression flickered once, like static, then vanished. He felt profoundly alone in his own skull, and for a moment that emptiness terrified him more than the cacophony had. Then he realized what the silence meant. He was still himself. A soft chime sounded. Yusuf's voice came through. "We're seeing full remission in your markers," he said, wonder in his tone. "Residual heliophage structures are embedded in Paxis colonies. Inert. It's over. For you, at least." "And the others?" Nikhil whispered. "Hospital numbers are dropping worldwide," Yusuf said. "We're not out of the woods. There are going to be late complications, long recoveries, but the curve has turned. We did it." Nikhil closed his eyes and let tears slide back into his hairline, not caring that the monitors recorded every spike in his emotion. On the surface, people stepped outside their homes and felt the air without flinching. Parents who had watched children gasp behind protective masks hugged them close, masks dangling, forgotten at their sides. Nurses in makeshift wards cried openly as beds emptied instead of filled. Omar received a terse communication from the Galactic Compact. The sterilization fleet's weapons were being stood down. The Disease Control Council demanded full access to Earth's data. Their language was stiff, but beneath it was something rawer. They had never expected to see a heliophage world recover. Earth's response was to point them to the Paxis servers that already held everything. There was nothing more to hoard. The cure belonged to anyone willing to apply it. The Mycoryn swarm, once an implacable wave of coordinated will, fractured. Ships whose crews had known only the directives of Valeth found new impulses stirring. Some continued on inertia toward pre-planned targets. But without the heliophage's backing, their threat was reduced. Others powered down entirely, drifting like trees severed from roots. The Spore Cathedral, robbed of much of its purpose, curled inward. Within it, pockets of now partially freed Mycoryn tissue sent out tentative chemical signals that, interpreted by human instruments, resembled nothing so much as a sigh. On Arkadia, emissary Talren stood before a container in which a sample of Mycoryn matter pulsed lightly. It was no longer attempting to infiltrate its environment. It merely rested, like any recovering organism. For eons, he said, knowing the translation system would carry his words to the sample's biochemical sensors in a crude way, "You have devoured. Now you know what it is to be spared." The sample responded by altering its chemistry in a pattern that suggested question. "Will you kill us now?" Talren glanced at the human scientists around him. Yusuf shook his head. No, Yusuf said. We will try to help you live without your weapon. It was a generous promise, and a dangerous one, but humanity had learned something about itself over these 45 days that made such a promise feel almost inevitable. It was not enough, they had discovered, to save their own skins. Their great strength was the ability to look at an enemy, at a creature that had tried in every way to wipe them out, and see in it the potential to be something else. Weeks later, as recovery solidified into a new normal, Arkadia Station became a beacon rather than merely a hospital. Ships came and went, some bringing Mycoryn fragments requesting asylum. Others delivered scientists from distant worlds, curious to see with their own eyes the place where a world had refused a script written for it. ESS Farlight was refitted, its hull bristling now not just with weapons, but with field projectors and bioreactors. It would not merely fight, it would carry remedies to other worlds when new plagues arose. In a quiet ward, Nikhil sat up in bed for the first time, without the monitoring web attached. His muscles were weak, his face gaunt, but his eyes were bright. Yusuf stood at the foot of the bed with a tablet. There's something you should see, Yusuf said. He played a short clip. A tropical village. A woman in a worn dress pumping a well. Children ran around her, laughing, splashing each other. A month ago, that well had tested positive for heliophage contamination. Now, thanks to Paxis cultures seeded upstream and Terracline pulses that had reset the local environment, its water was clean. The Paxis servers are full of videos like that now, Yusuf said. People wanted to send them to Arkadia, to show you, to show all of us that they're still here. Nikhil watched in silence. His gaze drifted past the small screen to the viewport, where Earth rose fully into view. It looked the same as it had before the storm. Blue, white, green, gold. It was not the same at all. It now carried, in every river and bloodstream, a trace of the decision it had made, to turn its entire self into a laboratory and a ward, to gamble on its own ingenuity instead of submitting. The door chimed. Omar stepped in, carrying his own fatigue like a cloak. Behind him, Mei-Rin leaned against the wall, still in uniform. Jonas appeared in the doorway a moment later, hands stained with machine grease, eyes ringed with tired lines. I have news from the Compact, Omar said, without preamble. Good and bad. The good? Nikhil asked. They have suspended all use of sterilization protocols pending review, Omar said. They want to study our methods. Some worlds are already applying Paxis cultures to lesser outbreaks. You have changed more than just our fate. And the bad? Mei-Rin asked. Omar's lips thinned. Someone else has been paying attention. There is a system on the far side of compact space where a different kind of pathogen is emerging. It is not Mycoryn. It is synthetic, built, piece by piece, by a species fascinated by what we just endured. They want to test whether they can outdo the heliophage without the drawbacks of a hive mind. In the silence that followed, the faint hum of Arcadia's environmental systems seemed suddenly louder. They want us to go, Omar continued. Not just as casualties this time, but as advisors, as the ones who know what it is to turn a weapon inside out. Mei-Rin's fingers tightened on her helmet. Jonas's mind leapt ahead to Terracline calibrations in unfamiliar atmospheres. Yusuf considered what new biological nightmares awaited. Nikhil looked back at the planet filling the window, the world he had nearly died to defend, the world that had turned itself into a healing engine. We just finished one impossible race, he said quietly, and now they ask us to run another. You could refuse, Omar said, though he already knew the answer. Nikhil thought of the silent heliophage world he had visited years ago, of the near miss of becoming another. He thought of the Mycoryn sample pulsing in its container down the hall, no longer a monster, merely a patient. He eased himself off the bed, his legs shaking, Yusuf ready to catch him if he stumbled. We are good at learning under fire, he said. That is who we are. That is what we did. If we can keep another world from living what we just lived, we have to try. Outside the viewport, small streaks of light marked ships lifting from Earth and from orbit. Among them was ESS Farlight, its engines warming, its destination set toward a new crisis. Humanity had been the world that would not be culled. Now, whether the galaxy was ready or not, it was on its way to becoming something stranger and more powerful. A species that healed other people's wounds, even when those wounds had been sharpened by what they had just survived. In the quiet between Terracline pulses and new missions, Earth turned alive.